Are you a narcissist? Would you even know if you were one? How about your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, or wife? Maybe one of your parents? Your boss? How might a narcissist trick you? How are male and female narcissists different? Did the self-esteem movement create more narcissists? And what role does social media play? Hey, look at my great life, everyone, and this amazing selfie. In a moment, my interview with psychology professor, author, and world-renowned narcissism expert, Keith Campbell, who will join me to break down the other epidemic on this episode of the narcissistically titled, How to Be More Like Bob Bowden. This program is sponsored by VidaFair, which is, by the way, my company, built on a dream. VidaFair allows independent video content creators, whether they be YouTubers, filmmakers, comedians, or musicians with music videos, to set their own fees for people to rent their videos, kind of like an Airbnb for content instead of condos. They'll get a link they can distribute far and wide to their followers who can then support that work, all without ever subscribing to anything. Hashtag subscription fatigue. But more on that later. Here's my interview with Keith Campbell. Keith, thanks for being on the program. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Okay, so I'm going to start with what might be called a softball, or maybe this is a layup feed. But don't worry, don't get overconfident. The questions will get harder later. But let's start. What is narcissism, and how is it different from just having a positive ego and a positive self-esteem? What's the difference?
Yeah, so that sounds like a real layup question, but it's a little complicated because we use the term narcissism in a few different ways. So we can think about narcissism as a personality trait. It's something we all have. You know, we can be a little more narcissistic or a little less narcissistic. And in terms of the personality trait, the simplest definition of narcissism is somebody who has an inflated or positive view of themselves, a general lack of empathy or close, loving relationships with other people, and then a need or desire to keep their ego inflated. So seeking attention, seeking admiration, etc. There can be a couple different forms of narcissism. What I'm talking about is a more grandiose form that most of us are used to in politics or bad ex relationships or whatever. There's also a little more of a defensive form you see clinically. Where the definition gets a little confusing is there's also a clinical disorder, a personality disorder called narcissistic personality disorder, which is a very extreme and inflexible form of narcissism. So it's very rare, maybe 1 or 2% of the population at any time. So sometimes people get confused where they're like, you're a narcissist, Keith. And you're like, are you saying I'm a little full of myself, got a little bit of an ego, a little bit self-centered, but okay? Or are you saying I have a clinical disorder and I need treatment?
Yeah.
And it gets mixed up.
So this gets me skipping. Gets me skipping ahead of my notes in my bit, but let's throw out the notes. But you say there are three. I've heard you say before in interviews there are three kinds. There's what you called grandiose narcissism. I presume that's the sort of conventional wisdom, sort of colloquial.
Very much.
Term.
Yes.
Vulnerable narcissism, a
yes.
second category, and then this third, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. So
yes,
you talked about grandiose narcissism is just what most
people
mean,
the vulnerable narcissism is something you see more in a clinical practice. It's somebody who thinks they're a big deal, but they're not really active, and so a lot of their grandiosity is in their fantasy. I'm a big deal. One day people will recognize what a genius I am, but I'm going to keep working at this coffee shop and just stewing in anger. Until everyone realizes it. So it's a more low self-esteem, defensive form of narcissism. You think, oh, these people don't recognize my genius. We don't see this form because it looks a lot on the outside like anxiety or depression or something. But if you're in a clinical setting, you start to talk and the clinicians are like, wait a second, you think you're a big deal, don't you? You don't seem like you do, but you do. So it's a much quieter presentation. You originally asked the difference between narcissism and self-esteem, which is a really good question. And the big people sometimes think, well, narcissism is like super self-esteem. Like I'm so confident I'm a narcissist. But really, it's a little different. Self-esteem is about feeling you're a person of worth, you're a good person, but so are other people. So, like, I like myself, I like my wife, I like the mailman, we're all good people. Narcissism's a little more like, I really like myself, and I think I'm better than my wife, and I'm better than the mailman, and I'm better than most other people. You know, I hang out with some cool people too, but I'm a little better than them too.
Okay. So, and then while we're on this, the narcissism personality disorder, this is the clinical diagnosis version. So I have to confess to you, I'm a recovering engineer or former engineer. And so, we generally like numbers to measure things. So if you tell a story about how, you were speeding or it's really hot outside, the story's better if the cop caught you when you were going 97 miles an hour, because it's a number, or it was 103 degrees outside, it was that hot. So but with these kind of diagnoses, there's a subjective aspect, and we'll often put these thresholds. Like, you can say someone's an alcoholic, but and I guess some experts got together to define what that threshold is. But you can at least quantify how many drinks a week are they having, or how many drinks per night, or something like that. How do they, with this NPD, like, I'm curious, I understand shorthand has value to have terms that mean things, but how would they define this threshold called, okay, now you've just crossed into the
magic
diagnosis
threshold
of NPD? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right.
This is incredibly challenging, because what you're hitting on is that there is no bright line between normal personality and abnormal or impaired personality. It's like a continuum. And what happened, it's just like high blood pressure. At some point, the doctor's like, well, 140 is high. 139, you're good. That doesn't mean anything. It was a decision made by clinicians. And what happens is clinicians, physicians, they have to treat people. They have to make a treatment decision. And so they cut what is an arbitrary line. And the way they do it clinically is they look at impairment. And so they say, if these narcissistic symptoms are leading to what we call clinically significant impairment in a couple different ways, then it's something we treat. And if it doesn't lead to impairment, it's not something we treat. So if you're fully yourself, but you're the king of a small country and it's working for you, that's not a disorder. But if you start ruining your work, you ruin your relationship with your spouse, you start making poor financial decisions because your ego gets in the way, and a physician goes, you know what, that's not normal. That's something we should work on. Yeah. But I won't say it's completely arbitrary, but it's certainly a judgment call by a trained expert. I'm a research psychologist. I'm not a clinician, so I am not qualified to say you have NPD and you don't. I can measure your narcissism. Pardon.
I've heard you say in other interviews that you do so often have a hunch, having studied this subject for
I certainly have my opinions, but as a legal and professional manner, I would not make any sort of diagnosis with somebody. I can give you a number from 1 to 100 compared to a population on a scale of narcissism, but I can't determine if that's clinical, because that's a clinical judgment that has to be made by a state licensed clinician.
Yeah. Incidentally, you mentioned, like, does it actually affect your life in a negative way? Like with alcohol, they do a lot of the same. That's part of it with alcohol.
Absolutely.
Too, right? Like, it's not just how many drinks you have per night; it's these other things.
Yeah, and those diagnoses are very complicated, and they get debated every time we redo the diagnostic manuals. People are debating substance use disorders, addictions, personality disorders. It's complicated. Yeah.
Because there's obviously value in having shorthand, but on the other hand, you're worried about it giving a free pass to the people who come up just short of the threshold, whether it's narcissism or alcohol, right? Like, you're kind of telling them, oh, you're okay, and they're actually may not be that okay.
Right. You can be a real jerk and not have a clinical disorder. Like, you can be a real crappy human being and not be pathological. You're just a bad guy. And that's okay. Okay. Like, you can drink and do dumb stuff and not be an alcoholic. It's just, Yeah, it's
I
not an
feel like I
excuse.
might edit out that one clip of you just telling me you're just a bad guy, and I'll just use
Use that as
that one clip as the YouTube short or something, Instagram story. Um, what I'll tell you what got me so interested in this subject, and I've been following it casually, but there was somewhere, and I wish I remembered the source. You may or may not know this, but know the source. But somebody looked at the scientific and published article references to narcissism versus self-esteem, and apparently, sometime in the mid or late '90s or early 2000s, the stories about building self-esteem exploded in the number. The studies published about self-esteem being great. We need to build more self-esteem. We need to give kids participation trophies. There was some sort of movement that seemed to like explode at that around that time, 20, 25 years ago.
Yes.
And no change in the number of stories about narcissism, meaning the responsibility side of, I guess, the equation, or the other side of that coin. And then and I looked this up, only by 2019, around 20 years later, Psychology Today then finally has a story, Why Self-Esteem Development is Overrated. Or 2021, The Atlantic publishes, American Parents Are Way Too Focused on Their Kids' Self-Esteem. Yeah. It seemed like these things are like, they get in vogue, right? They're trends, right? Somehow the self-esteem movement becomes like, we got to tell every kid that they're amazing. And then 20 years later, they're kind of like, maybe a little too much on the telling
maybe that
every
wasn't
kid
the
they're
best
amazing.
choice. Yeah. So what happened in the 1980s was they had the California Task Force on Self-Esteem and Social Responsibility. This was sort of the genesis of the self-esteem movement. It was a congressman whose last name was Vasconcellos, who was a good guy. I know my dad knew him, and he was kind of into Carl Rogers. And he had this idea that, we had a lot of social dysfunction in the 70s, 80s. And he thought, well, if we get kids' self-esteem, then they're going to not, screw around at school. Their grades are going to go up. They're going to feel good about themselves and do well. And so they started looking at this research-wise. They put out a book. It didn't seem like it was going to work back then, but they went for it anyway. So the educators started doing things like telling kids they're special, having them write what made them unique, having them write, stories about what made them stand apart from other people. We had grade inflation, which was always an issue after World War II, start going up and up because we didn't want to give kids negative feedback. The self-esteem movement went on for, I bet, 15, I'd measured, I'm guessing 15, 20 years. When Gene and I wrote The Narcissism Epidemic, I really looked into this sort of history, and it worked in a way. Kids' self-esteem did go up, but it didn't seem to have all the positive benefits people thought it would have. And we also saw a big increase in narcissism. So we had self-esteem go up, we had narcissism go up. I think the reason for that is if you want a child to have healthy self-esteem, you give them love. I love you, son. Not that I think you're special. I love you. And you give them age-appropriate challenges they can meet. Hey, let's do this challenge. It's going to be tough, Dad. That's okay. We can work hard and do it. And so if you feel loved and you have challenges, you'll build healthy self-esteem. If I try to short circuit that process and say, hey, Bob, you're special just the way you are, but I have to, you don't have to do anything. You're awesome, man. Let's talk about how awesome Bob is. That creates unhinged self-esteem, which looks a lot like narcissism. And so it's not a good idea. But I like
your distinction earlier where you also the focus on others too. It's not just that I'm great. It's that
everybody,
these other people are also great and good. And you could tell kids that, like, why don't you go, tell your sister what a great job she did on the project or something, like make it not all about just them,
absolutely.
Right?
A lot of our self-esteem comes from belongingness, feeling connected to a group. It could be a team. It could be our class. It could be our friendship group. It could be our neighbors. So as long as we have that connection, it's great. But when you take away that connection, you atomize and isolate people and say, you're different than you and you're different than you and you're all great. It makes people miserable. Maybe on the surface, they'll be narcissistic, but underneath it, they don't have a lot of support. It's not a good way to raise people.
It's like a pleasure versus happiness distinction.
That's
Would you
kind of
go
interesting
along with
way to
that?
think about
Yeah.
it. Yeah, it's not really like real happiness. It's more like kind of
Right.
sugar high stuff. It's a
Yes.
little bit.
Yes.
Yeah, that's I think Gene and I would talk about it like kind of like fruity pebbles of self-esteem. It's not a lot of nutrition to it.
Well, I was going to mention, and probably should have at the top, of the book, The Narcissism Epidemic, which you wrote in 2009. I guess it came out, a seminal piece, quoted thousands of times by people all over. Um, and so, to some extent, though, that book preceded the social media epidemic. So,
Yes.
one cause I was going to hit. One cause I was going to hit you up with was this idea of like participation trophies and telling every kid they're great. But then you've got this, Twitter and X, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, whole thing coming of people constantly taking pictures of themselves to show how great their life is.
Yeah.
To what degree has that been a driver of narcissism?
So it's a little bit of a complicated story. When we first started doing this was, right at the beginning of social media. My grad student Laura, first study we did on Facebook and narcissism, I think was like 06, 07, 08, somewhere around there. And we found, and we still find, that the people who are engaged and high users of social media tend to be more narcissistic. The people who have more friends, the people that post more, the people that do more selfies, especially if they're isolated with their shirt off, kind of self-promotional selfies. So there's a lot of draw for social media for narcissists. I mean, it's kind of a good land for narcissism. When it originally happened, what I thought would happen was that, hey, everyone's going to run away and just become inflated because everyone has this social media. And it looked like that initially. We saw this kind of run up in narcissism. But then what we started seeing in about 2012, 2013 was that people started getting depressed online. And I think especially it was younger women. And I think part of what was going on was being online was invoking a lot of social comparison processes. People were feeling they were missing out. They weren't as good as other people. And so we ended up with social media actually making people somewhat anxious and depressed at a cultural level.
In the sense where you could correlate the amount of usage of social media hours a week or something like that, and then check where they stand on happiness surveys.
Here is where it gets really hard. And this is why I don't talk about this a lot publicly. There's really two questions. One question is, hey, I took a nice society and I threw social media on it. Did it make everybody more narcissistic or more depressed? How did it affect the entire society? The other question is, how much did it affect each individual using social media? So at the individual level, does using social media increase or decrease narcissism or depression? So you can look at the question in a couple different ways, and it gets complicated depending on how you do it. So when you look at the individual question, what it seems to do is social media seems to be reinforcing for people who are narcissistic. So if you start off pretty narcissistic, you get on social media and you can use social media, and that helps you maintain your level of narcissism. You can use social media to promote yourself, to get attention. But it doesn't seem to turn other people into narcissists. So it doesn't seem like you take, somebody who's pretty not narcissistic, you put them on social media. It doesn't seem to turn them into narcissistic individuals as much as maintain it.
Oh, okay.
Which is different than I originally thought would happen.
Huh. So that may have actually answered the next question before I ask it, but because I was thinking to myself, there's this one factor of people posting about themselves. Look at this beautiful vacation I'm on. Look at this amazing meal I'm having. Look at this fun I'm having at a party. Aren't I great? What a great life I have. I have a better life than you, or at least I just have an amazing life. I'll leave you to compare. Seems to me there's a different factor of us all consuming such niche and tailored news and information in the social media era, where gee, I wrote down the boy is, dad is watching YouTubes about military history and basketball. Mom is deeply into true crime documentaries. Boy is playing Call of Duty and Minecraft. Girl is following the Taylor Swift gossip, whatever, call it stereotypes. But that everyone is doing different, consuming different media about different hobbies and becoming less connected. And therefore, one could argue that they are more about themselves than they were before when they were, when a third of the country was watching, the same TV show like Johnny Carson.
I was going to say Johnny Carson, man. Yes.
You understand the idea. Yeah.
100%.
Right. So that's different from posting. That's different from posting things about how great my life is. That's just us becoming siloed into our world is now less like your world.
100%. And the way I think about that is atomization. That sort of we're all being separate, individualized, atomized with our own content channel. Or we're basically all being, it's the matrix. We're all kind of put in this world where we get fed customized information. And the way the algorithms work is it's primarily self-reinforcing. So if I'm into military history, I'm going to get more and more military history, and my daughter's going to get more and more Taylor Swift. And so what that does is it separates us as humans. And in the old days, as much as I can bag on TV, when I was sitting around at 11 or whenever 11:30 Johnny Carson would come on, I can't even remember. Everybody in the country
Eastern time 11:30, Central time 10:30.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody in the country watched Johnny Carson. Right. So the next day at the water cooler, everybody's like, oh, did you see so-and-so on Johnny Carson? You see Ed McMahon. He was a pretty funny guy last night. We don't have that except for some sports now. We don't really have that shared culture. Instead, what we have is this very individualized culture.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt, but it's not just the media. It's also sitting around a dinner table where they're all that used to happen way more than it does now, or taking going camping with the family that used to happen way more than it does now, and just all kinds of ways where I think experiences were more shared by nothing's an absolute, but in general, I think there were more shared experiences, and now we have my phone, and now this is my individual experience that has nothing to do with yours.
Even when we're all sitting together. So if you go watch a group of kids sit down at a restaurant, they all pull out their phones and they're all kind of talking to people who aren't there. If you go watch a video from the 90s, everybody's happy. All the kids are happy and talking to each other. Sometimes I'll show my class. I'm like, look at this video from 20 years ago. Look how happy everybody is. They're just talking to each other because they're not distracted by their phones. It's unbelievable.
Now, a lot of times it's true, isn't it, that narcissists seem great when you meet them, right? Aren't they often fun and they're a lot of energy?
Yes.
They are the life of the party.
Not only do they sometimes seem great, but on average, when you meet people who are again, on this grandiose side of narcissism, they tend to be likable when you first meet them, especially the first 30 seconds. They tend to be judged more attractive. They tend to be more likely to be, given leadership positions, more likely to rise as leaders. There's a lot of benefits to narcissism in those very early interactions. And a lot of it is the extroversion. It's that energy. It's that enthusiasm and confidence, assertiveness. Those are likable traits.
Sure. And so I guess there's some sort of turn later. Like when is the...
Yes, that's the problem. Yeah, I mean...
When is the bad news hit? Is it hit in general the next day or the next week? I guess there's no way.
6 months, it depends. I mean, it depends. You're in something like a romantic situation, the way we date in our cultures, typically it starts off kind of exciting and fun and a little more, sort of sexualized at first. And then it becomes more about emotional intimacy. And there's a transition there from sort of fun to intimacy over, say, 6 months. That transition doesn't really happen with somebody who's really narcissistic. They don't go from excitement to like deep connection and let's really get to meet each other's parents. It's sort of like it stays shallow the whole time. So it just depends. With a leader, you have a honeymoon period and then it will get bad. Could be a couple months. Could be pretty quick. But yeah, it doesn't last long.
You touched on this before, but I was preparing for this interview, and I was reading about how American men and women are on different tracks when it comes to narcissism, right? Let's just start there, right? Aren't men more likely to be narcissists? Thanks for watching part 1, but please consider renting part 2, where you'll hear Keith Campbell answer that question I just posed to him about male versus female narcissism rates. We're also going to talk about the stylistic differences between men and women as narcissists, as well as the question of whether rising autism rates that have been recorded around the country as well as around the world might be causally connected to more narcissists than ever. That's all in part 2. You rent it for just $1.99. Even that price is the a la carte price. You pay even less by buying the platform tokens called grains. It's on the VidaFair platform. There will be a link in the description of this part 1 that you can use to go to that part 2. And the concept of the company is simple. It says that content creators, whether they be filmmakers or video content creators, should be able to monetize their work, meaning make money from their work, without ever asking you, the viewer, to subscribe. I'm sick of subscribing to things. I'm sick of forgetting to unsubscribe to things I no longer watch, and I have a feeling you are too. And this just says, why shouldn't there be a way for content creators to set a simple price, maybe a price low enough you wouldn't even notice if it were added or subtracted from your restaurant bill? A small, fair, simple price that you pay, and then you never have to pay another penny. That's what our platform does. And if you still want discounts, you can buy the grain packages, which are the platform tokens. But apart from that, thanks again for watching, and also consider giving us a like and subscribe on this free platform for part 1 of what's called How to Be More Like Bob Bowden. Admittedly, a rather narcissistic title for a podcast, but that's why we had Keith Campbell on. And we'll see you next time.